Nathan Eckstrand, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Welcome to everyone in the Sophia audience, Blogging Heads TV, meaningoflife.tv. I am here with Nathan Eckstrand. Nathan is visiting assistant professor at Fort Hays State University. He's editor of the American Philosophical Association's blog, which is the way by which I know him primarily. His main research right now is centers around the question of how to conceive of revolution and resistance without advocating for any particular type of political state, which really sounds kind of interesting and not a standard topic. Nathan, the occasion of our talking is an essay that you wrote that's now appeared both in the London School of Economics blog as well as on the American Philosophical Association's blog. Is it appeared anywhere else, Nathan?
Well, I got the Daily News to link to it, and I've been trying to get other people to mention it, but no, it hasn't been published anywhere else.
Okay.
It may be published somewhere else in the future, but that's still up in the air in some of the discussions I'm having.
And the essay is entitled, "Is It Time for the Humanities to Strike?" By which he means go on strike, not strike like as in an airstrike. And we did some talking behind the scenes, and Nathan approached me as we had been in communication. We published a piece of his at the Electric Agora, and I offered to talk with him about the piece. And so, Nathan, I think maybe the way to go about this is for you to summarize what your main point was in writing the piece. And then maybe we can have a conversation about it.
Sure. So the piece is meant to start a discussion. As I realize the idea is controversial and that it's going to be something that will create, some people who I guess really want to do it, some people who are going to be hesitant to do it, other people who will very much resist the idea. But I think the idea should be talked about. And so the piece is meant to put forth this idea and argue as to why it's necessary. And so the piece begins by laying out the sort of crisis of the humanities, to borrow some other people's terms, by discussing how people are leaving the profession, less tenured fact jobs, more adjuncts, those sorts of things, but also then how the consensus view, from what I found, is that the humanities should stick around. And I linked to, I believe it's about 8 or 9 different newspapers that published editorials saying as much, including conservative ones. So it's not a partisan position by any means. And then discussing why it seems that despite the consensus that we want the humanities, we still haven't found a good solution for it, and still seeing cutbacks more or less across the board, and reaching the conclusion that it seems like it's probable that we are not able to find a good solution because not that many people know about the problem or are not fully aware of how significant the problem is, arguing thus as a conclusion that this really needs to be brought to the public's attention in a very, significant and visceral way. What does a society without the humanities look like? And saying that maybe a strike would be the best way to do that, because we, as humanities professors and people who advocate for it, don't generally have access to mass media. We have our blogs, we have our books, and so on, but it's very difficult, at least from the people I've talked to and in my own personal experience, to reach large numbers of people using those means, and saying maybe the strike would be the most effective way. And just kind of concluding that we should consider this, and my view, talk about it very seriously. And then I wanted to see where it goes from there, what people think about it, and that's sort of the state we're at right now.
So let me just ask you a couple of things. I mean, one thing is, this are you primarily addressing this problem as it occurs in the sort of Anglophone universities? The reason I'm asking is that my impression is that the humanities have more clout in Europe and are not quite in the situation they're in the U.S. and the U.K.
Yeah, I was, when I wrote the piece, originally thinking really just about the U.S. In preparing the piece and submitting it to a couple different places, I got a request from the editor of the London School of Economics blog to make it more international focused, so I added the paragraph about what's going on in the UK. And then I had a paragraph about some other places in the world where it is a problem in different ways. So, you have issues of humanities professors being attacked, sometimes physically, in Latin American countries. I've been in contact with someone in Brazil recently who talked about some of the dangers faced because of the new president there.
Yeah.
So
Hungary also, if I'm correct. Yeah.
So it's written primarily for the U.S., but includes paragraphs that point to how this is a worldwide problem, although it manifests itself in different ways in different countries.
It's just that I know that in countries like France, for example, there's philosophy in high school. In other words, when you talk about philosophers or other sorts of humanists not getting airtime, and I'm under the impression that at least in France, and I thought in Germany as well, that they have a bit more public visibility, and I didn't think that the problem was quite as bad there. It does seem to me that the problem in a place like the U.S. and the U.K. Is of a different sort than the problem as it occurs in a place like Latin America. I mean, there, it seems to me the problem is much more political, right? It has, in the sense that it has to do with regimes seeing this kind of inquiry as a threat, whereas in the developed world in the West, it strikes me as being really a matter of the economics of the university, of the spending priorities having changed. Does that seem fair to you, or?
I think it is fair, although I would want to add a couple more points to that, there's a variety of ideologies that see the humanities as threats. In the U.S., UK, the threat I point to primarily in the piece is one of neoliberalism, economics, and sort of the economic value that the humanities have, and that a lot of people, a lot of ideologies see the humanities not providing much important economic value. In other parts of the world, I think you see the threat coming from maybe sometimes the more nationalistic or authoritarian ideology, and that would more or less be the reason why I think the humanities are under threat in Brazil, that there's a very strong nationalistic movement, and the person in charge, Bolsonaro, of course, has a very significantly authoritarian way of approaching politics, and I think, as you rightly point out, he does see humanities, sort of that type of questioning that the humanities do, as a threat to his ability to control and move the people of Brazil in the direction that he thinks they should be moved.
Right. So I guess the two real questions are, well, I mean, there's more than two, but the two I can think of that would be maybe useful to address here is one, why are you so sure that the contraction or the shrinking of the amount of humanistic learning that's going to be provided at our higher education institutions, why are you so sure that that's not well motivated? Or I guess that you might think it's well motivated, but think it'll have a bad outcome. But whatever, however you think of it, that's question number one. And then question number two is, if you are persuaded of that, then why do you think a strike is sort of the way to sort of go about doing this? So maybe we'll take them in order. Why? Here's something that I've said, and I wonder what you think of it. it was a fundamental mistake from day one to take the university as it existed now for centuries and turn it into an instrument of mass education. That the minute you did that, you were guaranteeing that it was going to go bust. It was not. It's simply too expensive. And most people, after they get out of high school, require some sort of professional training. They don't require an enormously expensive 4-year education with research institutes and very highly educated scholars. And this used to be an education for essentially the elites. And it seems to me now what happened was we tried to turn this into a system of mass education. We found out we can't afford it. And so what's going to wind up happening is 3/4 of them are going to turn into essentially white-collar votex, and then the rest are going to be elite again. And I guess what I'm wondering is why doesn't that arc sort of show that the thing was a mistake to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts come to mind. The first is whether or not it was possible to avoid turning into a system of mass higher education. I can't remember some of the reading I did about this when I was in grad school, but I remember reading some arguments that said the only way the university could survive was to do that. But that's a little beside the point. It's, I think, worth looking into. But the real sort of more appropriate answer to your question that I would want to put forth is the idea that I don't think a healthy, strong, robust democratic society will be possible without having a liberal arts education understood in a broad sense. And the argument for that comes, for me, primarily from my studies of systems theory, which I use in my research and in my dissertation, and I'm currently working on in my...
Can you say a little bit about what that is? Because I am woefully ignorant of it, and people in the audience may have no idea whatsoever. So could you explain what it is and then explain the relevance of it to what you're talking about?
Sure. So systems theory examines how systems work, systems being defined very broadly as structures where you have at least two agents. In most systems, you're going to have many, many more than that, and relationships that affect how the agents operate, what they do, how they act, and so forth. It uses a lot of mathematics because you need to project, plans about how agents will act, and it also uses set theory, nonlinear thinking, in order to try to predict what will happen when systems adapt and change and modify themselves in relation or in reaction to things that happen both within them and externally to them. So, for instance, systems theory has been used a lot recently with regard to the spread of diseases. What sort of actions will be effective in preventing the spread of diseases? How do the diseases spread? How can we make society resilient to the spread of diseases? And that's actually how I first encountered it, because my mother, she was working for NIH at the time and participating in this, and so she was reading about systems theory, and we were talking about it. What she was saying sounded relevant to what I was saying in my dissertation, and I've just kind of taken it from there. But one of the things you learn about in systems theory is the importance of effective, healthy systems in being resilient. That is, they can respond effectively to events that threaten their own integrity. And in order to do that, you need to understand how different parts of the systems work and what you can do to prevent threats or dangers to other parts of the system. And that is where I would make the argument that you need a liberal arts education. And when I say liberal arts, I don't just mean humanities, but I see their greatest threat coming there. So that's what I'm focused on in the piece.
You include mathematics as well, and
absolutely.
Yes.
Because
yes.
I would say in order to do my job as a professor, I need to know what other people in other parts of my system, in this case society, are doing. It may be the case that students need a stronger education in, let's say, quantum physics or string theory, and as a philosophy professor, it will be important for me to be able to teach the concepts that will help students to understand that down the line so they can play their role in society later on. Or if we are to have an effective society, I think it's useful for students to be able to understand the policies that the politicians are putting forth, in which case I should spend some time teaching the philosophy relevant to understanding, what's behind, say, the Affordable Care Act or the immigration policies that President Trump is putting forth right now. I think that all people in society need to be at least basically cognizant of what challenges are being faced by other parts of society so that they can play their role in effectively responding to dangers to the system. So I think it's useful for people, no matter what job they have, what role they play, to know what's going on in politics and academia, to at least be basically familiar with some of the concepts surrounding, political theory, economic theory. That's why I'm arguing for a liberal education, a liberal arts education for everyone. So we have this general familiarity with how our system works, what sort of challenges it faces, and what people in different parts of the system would need to do to respond to those threats. And I don't think a vocational education is going to provide that.
Well, but then it seems to me, rather than writing an essay about going on strike to protest and draw awareness to the shrinking humanities within the university, it seems to me the paper needs to be why either university education must be ubiquitous, or why those without university education should not be allowed to vote in elections. Or, in other words, there seems to me to be a somewhat of a utopianism to what you're describing that doesn't sort of seem to me to really meet the facts on the ground. I mean, the facts on the ground are that, large percentages of people never receive any university of education. They're plumbers, they're electricians, they're roofers, they're groundskeepers, etc. Are you seriously suggesting that these people have to have this sort of education before they can participate as citizens in a democracy and exercise the franchise?
Well, no. Again, you're more accurate in the first way you characterized my position, not the second way. I'm not arguing for going back to some sort of elitism, because my research would.
Of course not. I know you're not.
That's pretty ineffective too.
So you're saying,
but I am arguing that society would be better off if we did educate these people in a more robust, resilient way, or robust way that had a liberal arts background to it. And it is utopian in the sense that it's a long-term plan for how I think society should move. The piece here is not meant to outline the totality of what I think the perfect system for society
Fair
is.
enough, of course.
Simply wait for my book to come out if you want to see some of that.
Right. You read the rest of my articles, which will be about these other things. Fair enough. No, I don't mean it that way. I'm just trying to sort of push you in various ways. I guess I have a serious problem with the idea that somehow a waitress is a deficient voter relative to a college graduate. I'm not sure I think that's true. I actually think I could make arguments that the opposite is the case. I've argued elsewhere that it's really interesting that all the worst people that did all the worst things to our country all had these really great liberal arts educations. I mean, the Ken Lays and the corporate shitheads and the hedge fund guys and all these people. I'm not convinced that it's as effective as you think it is for making people into wonderful citizens. And B, I'm not at all convinced that it's necessary for people to be decent, good, responsible citizens. And I guess I don't see how you avoid the implication that there is something deficient, relatively speaking, about the cocktail waitress Quay voter and the university graduate Quay voter. And I guess I would need to be sold on that a lot more beyond simply pointing towards abstract things that you think people ought to know, right? I guess I don't see how you avoid some sort of implication like that, and I guess I just don't buy it.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, the best way of having this sort of discussion would be to provide more facts for either side, because I think in order to prove either case, we need some empirical evidence. This is a point where I actually found writing the article to be more than a little frustrating, because I don't see a lot of empirical evidence being done to prove this. Another reason why I want to draw the public's attention to it, because the empirical evidence showing the value of humanities is actually not as strong as I want it to be, which leaves, people like you and me, sort of, we have to speculate what the value of the humanities is.
Or depend upon anecdotal sort of experiences.
So my argument here, as I said, is drawn from systems theory and the study of how systems work. Now, no one has really done empirical studies of society writ large with regard to how the humanities operate within that system. So it's more that I'm taking concepts that were applicable and seem to be widespread in another field and trying to apply it to this concept of seeing society as a similarly complex, adaptive, dynamic system. Now, with regard to your argument that cocktail waitresses are more deficient than, say, the Ken Lays,
well, I thought
that's
it was
really not exactly how I would phrase it. Go ahead.
I thought it would be hard to avoid that as an implication of what you're advocating on behalf of.
What's deficient is people who are not attentive to the needs and concerns of their society. A cocktail waitress could be perfectly attentive to that. I've encountered people who never had a college education, but took it on themselves to inform themselves about critical thinking, educated themselves, engaged with people who were trained in that sort of thing. And I would say they're more responsible than the people in positions of power who don't take the time to do that. So my argument really isn't for a higher education as such, but that you want people who are attentive to the needs of society around them. And I do think that the school system, the university system, can play a vital role and should play a vital role in that. In fact, I don't see really any other institution that can play a similar role. The people that I'm pointing to, so who weren't college educated, who nevertheless are quite responsible, they took it upon themselves and were supported by their community and by the people they encountered in pursuing that sort of responsibility. I think, highly of them, very, thrilled and honored to meet them at times and to, help them with their experiences, and also to have them inform my own politics and my own experiences, because it really is a back and forth, not a one-way system. But they kind of had to do that on their own. I think there should be mechanisms, processes, institutions in society that encourage that sort of behavior, and that's what I would like to see the university system do. And when it comes to people like, the Wall Street hedge fund managers and so on, I actually think the university system failed them because it created them as people who don't really have any sort of passion for understanding what other people in society go through, concern and care for the needs of other people in society. So in those situations, I would say they're, in a sense, just as deficient, if not more deficient, than sort of the cocktail waitress who has good intentions perhaps, but doesn't have the information they need to make responsible, reasoned decisions.
Yeah, look, and this is something the audience should be aware that I'm actually talking to Nathan. Nathan's in China, so we're working with a very large time difference, and Nathan's time is limited. So to properly explore all of this would take far longer than we have, and so I'm not gonna push it. One of the things I would want to sort of explore is the inference that, for example, learning ethics at a university makes you ethical. And I think that's just doesn't, not only do I think it doesn't follow, I think it would be very odd if that actually was the case. And that's something maybe we could talk about on another occasion, because I'm hoping that we can have a follow-up discussion on this. I'll only ask you one more thing along these lines before we talk about the strike, why the strike you think is a good remedy. And one more thing about why the university. Look, given the realities of the economics of the university, we're simply not going to ever have universal university education. It seems to me very unlikely. Mm-hmm. If we accept everything you say about the value of these studies, why shouldn't we rather be exerting our efforts to try and have them play a far more prominent role in primary education, primary and secondary education? In other words, high school. I'm thinking of Catholic education, which has quite a robust philosophical component to it. I did some work in educational philosophy a while back when I was in graduate school, and I did some actual site visits and stuff. I was really quite impressed by some of the Catholic school curricula, and also the sort of the environment, the disciplinary environment in which the teaching was done. If this is so important to citizenship in a democracy, why shouldn't it be delivered at the level where education is ubiquitous, and that's K through 12?
Yeah, I actually agree with that point 100%. If you read the piece closely, I'm not arguing for the university system as such. What I'm arguing for is the institution of the humanities and a education in the humanities. While I do enjoy the university system, I enjoy the environment of the university system, I enjoy my colleagues at universities and sort of the general attitude they have, that's not what I'm arguing for saving. What I'm arguing for saving is the institution of the humanities and education in that. If we could salvage it without salvaging the university system as such, I don't really think I'd have a significant problem with that, as long as the integrity of the humanities and a humanities education is maintained. So I'm actually all for putting humanities into the K through 12 curriculum. I also think it would be worthwhile to spread humanities values and education outside the university system as well. Every so often I hear interesting ideas for roles philosophers, English professors, theologists could play outside the university system, and I actually believe that would be an important role. I think it should be the case that more people, especially those who don't have access to a university education, still get to encounter the humanities values, humanities mindset, and people who are trained in that. That's the main. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I've argued for something similar like to that myself, and that I feel like even within the academy, our role has gotten pretty narrow.
Honestly, I like it. Go ahead.
Even aside from all the issues of funding and cuts and all of that, even if the funding was all there and everything was great, I feel like our role has gotten pretty narrow. And I would like to see us a lot more involved in sort of educating people in a more public way. But this is a good point then to segue. So if the issue is not saving humanities in the university per se, but saving the humanities or re-emphasizing or reiterating or getting the public interested in, then why the mechanism of a strike? I mean, that really does seem like to be something that would be designed to fix a problem in the university. That's certainly not going to produce a renaissance of high school philosophy teaching or whatever. So what is it you have in mind? Why the mechanism of the strike in light of what you've just been saying?
So the strike was conceived of as a way of bringing the issue to the forefront of public deliberation, as much as such a thing is possible. As I say in the piece, there's other concerns. I don't mean to imply that we shouldn't think about climate change or ending war. Some of the humanitarian disasters in other parts of the world, certainly those still deserve consideration. But I do think that the threat of humanities education and the institution of the humanities as, a thing where people trained in this are involved in working with and helping the community, that needs to be saved. I don't see many options besides a strike, quite honestly. The news seems quite reluctant to cover it. Again, when I was doing my research for this piece, the only evidence or news coverage I could really find of it tended to be editorials where newspapers would say they think it's important. And there would be some minor stories here and there and about policies that certain countries or universities were including, but they never made it to the front page. They certainly, I couldn't find any coverage of it in the cable news media. They don't seem to cover it or talk about it much at all.
Yeah, right.
And then, of course, social media, where most people get their news, I don't think you're going to come across it unless friends that you know are sharing it. So this is a way of trying to bring it to the public's attention, putting it out there for the humanities professors. That's done primarily as a way because I think these are the people most interested in it. Hopefully, and again, I don't really know if this is going to happen, other people become interested in it as well. There is some, evidence that might be the case because the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, when the administration threatened to slash the humanities budget there, it was true that the students got involved. And I'd be curious, although I really don't know whether this could happen or not, if this issue is brought before the public and the public gets a chance to hear about it and think about it and decide their course of action, would some of them be interested in joining a strike that is attempting to save the value of the humanities and a humanities education for society as a whole? Again, to kind of bring it back to this question of the strike, I wrote the piece not because I was sure that a strike would work, but because I was sure that a discussion about it needs to happen among more people than just a small minority here and there. And I'm hoping that the piece starts the discussion and creates a more broad question of what role should the humanities play? How can we try to encourage them in society among more than just me and some people I know, but among hopefully humanities professors throughout society. And then if it gets enough publicity, and again, I'm sure this is me being idealistic, but maybe other people in society will want to get involved as well. I would actually want to hear their thoughts about what they would like to see happen with the humanities before any long-term plans get finalized.
Yeah, I mean, you're surely right that this is not really getting onto any major radar. I mean, look, even when our most publicly recognizable voices address this. So Martha Nussbaum wrote a whole book about this not that long ago. And as far as I could tell, it got no attention at all. I mean, I barely heard any talk of it. It's certainly, if she wound up being interviewed in some newspaper or something, maybe I'm sure she was somewhere, but I don't recall it ever gaining any traction or ever having any sort of effect. I'm of the inclination to say that strikes are best used for the purpose of obtaining very specific, tangible goals, right? A pay increase, extended family leave time, labor sort of related issues. The use of a strike to sort of draw awareness to an issue, I'm more dubious about, but that's purely a strategic and tactical matter that may not be worth, sort of batting back and forth. It's worth noting to the audience who will read the piece because it will be linked, that you do take a sort of an example from the Greta Thunberg environmental strike, so to speak, which there, I mean, while there are specific policy outcomes, clearly the point of it is to sort of get people attention and get them talking. So are you sufficiently confident of this second, more amorphous use of a strike as opposed to the more traditional, very targeted, specific of the efficacy of it for this sort of use? Because then it's sort of winds up being a stunt, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In a way?
I'm confident that it's a possibility, not that it is a likelihood, because I honestly don't know. I have spent a lot of time studying social movements, and really the truth of the matter is no one knows what happens going into them, what they will do. Even the best predictions from some of the most informed social scientists, political scientists, and so on, have been drastically wrong when it comes to social movements throughout history. I think it's really dangerous and naive to make predictions going in about what will happen. And in fact, if I could just, give on a little bit of a soapbox for a moment, the comments I've received so far in response to the piece, I mean, some have been supportive, some really like the idea. The ones that haven't liked the idea tend to be of the view that philosophers won't want to do this, humanities professors won't want to do it, that humanities professors, they're not going to give up a cushy check and join adjuncts out in the street. And my thought process is that I really don't know. Professors of the humanities What's that?
How would they know that?
Yeah, I don't know. We're a diverse group, I believe, and I certainly know some who would resist the whole idea of going out in the streets, but I know others who would relish the opportunity to advocate for the humanities with the public at large. So I'm really cautioning everyone who hears this, who reads the piece, to take the time to share their view and listen to others, but to not approach the idea with pre-made conclusions about what people in the humanities professions will say, because I don't know, I would imagine no one really does, and before we decide what to do, I want a discussion to happen.
Something you said before sort of struck me, and I just want to see if I heard it correctly. Are you saying that social scientifically speaking, even at this point, we really don't know about the efficacy of strikes and the various sorts of... I'm a little surprised, only because the labor movement now goes back enough time that I have to think that people have studied this in depth. Do we really not know what...
I'm speaking about social movements, qua-social movements. As the social movements as a phenomenon, it's still very difficult to make predictions about what will happen in them. You can make more narrow, clear predictions about, let's say, the importance of having a leader who people can unite behind, or having a clear message. But now about the efficacy of strikes, about how a social movement will turn out in advance, I've seen no evidence of that, of people being able to predict effectively how that will work. You can just look at election predictions as good examples of this. That I've heard quite a few people talk about how we shouldn't count out some of the less well-known Democrats right now, because if you look back at 2016, at this point everyone was under the impression Jeb Bush would have the presidential nomination in a lockup. And social movements can be just as unpredictable as presidential elections. So yeah, I think it's difficult and next to impossible at the moment to make clear predictions about what will happen in a social movement. Narrower predictions, yes, are more possible, but that's not what we're talking about here.
There's one more thing. Do you have time for me to ask you one more thing? I don't want to.
Yeah, one more question, and then I'll probably need to get going.
Yeah. So this is the last thing I thought of when I read the piece, and that is the people and the people in the places that you need to do the most work.
Mm-hmm.
have a pretty negative image of humanists already. In other words, aside from the budget priority / practical job after college concern, there is also quite a deal of a good amount of ideological hostility. So I live in a red state. I live in a state with a very conservative state legislature. It has a huge effect on my university because we're public. And I guess what I'm wondering is the people you need to convince the most, before you even get to the point of a strike, don't you need to first sort of rehabilitate the image of the humanities? Because these people are convinced that we're just all a bunch of seditious, atheistic, I'm not joking.
Yeah, I know. I encountered the same thing. So.
In other words, the strike presumes that there'd be a kind of a sympathetic reaction, but if you're the population you need to convince the most already want to be rid of all of us, it doesn't seem to me that a strike is a very good strategy. So what are you thinking about with regard to these more hostile populations, which is really where you need to do the most work?
Yeah. The strike is meant to raise the issue among the population at large. It's not meant to be the end of the discussion about the issue. In fact, I would want, and I would argue that evidence does show that having a multi-tiered, multi-vectored sort of strategy would be most effective. Where I'm living and working right now, I am in a community of highly Christian, highly evangelical, conservative individuals. In fact, the number of people who don't identify as evangelical Christians, I could count on one hand. So I've had numerous conversations with them about sort of the value of higher education, the value of the humanities. What I think is most important to them is that we show that we take their concerns seriously and we listen to them. Now, you can't do that with a strike, but you can do that on, more informal interactions. And I do think the university system and people within it do a poor job of actually listening to and taking the concerns of the population seriously. When I interact with people here, even though sometimes we disagree quite dramatically, for instance, on the topic of evolution, I still, in my discussions, try to show I take their concerns seriously, think through what I like, what I don't like, where I can agree, where I don't agree, what, some places they could look to maybe help them to think differently about the issue. I ask for sources they could give me to help me think differently about the issue, to show that we really do see these sorts of dialogues as interactive, and that it's not meant to be just sort of like we're the university system, we're the professors, you should listen to what we say, sort of interaction. And I think that does help, not in the sense of convincing them that we are correct, but convincing them that the people in it are not closed-minded, are not, uninterested in their political views or just their views of any sort. So those sorts of interactions, I think, are necessary too, to show that, we do have this strike, we do have a position, we are also at the same time open to hearing their thoughts, engaging with them, considering what they need from us and what we can give to them, all for the purpose of creating a healthier society. And so that would be part of my larger political strategy with this strike, but of course it's a little outside the purview of the piece, which is why it's not in it.
No, and I wasn't asking because I thought it should be in it. You make it very clear that you by no means think a strike is sufficient to do what you thinks needs to be done. It's one part of what you would say has to be a comprehensive approach to trying to rehabilitate and reintegrate and reemphasize the humanities within our educational system. So I appreciate that. Well, listen, I wish I had more of you, and I hope maybe we can do it again. There's a whole bunch of things I'd love to ask you, but right now it's important, I think, that people read the piece and that the word get out. You know, you're doing something important, and so it seems to me that it should be at least confronted, and so I want to thank you very much for approaching me with this, and I hope I can talk to you again.
I would love that, and thank you for the invitation to speak here, and to all your listeners and readers of Electric Agora. As I said earlier in the piece, this is meant to start a discussion, not end one. So I really am serious about listening to criticism from whoever gets a hold of the piece. You know, please do comment on it, send me emails, and so on. Will inform me going forward, and yeah, I look forward to seeing what people think and hearing how the discipline reacts.
Great. All right. Well, you take care of yourself, and I hope to see you again soon.
Yep. Take care.
All right. Take care.